Salam, my Rafiq, episode 13, part 13. Unobservable absolutes. Only differences speak. There is one primitive, phi, the holophase, the continuous cyclic order that makes reality readable. Everything else is readout, licensing, constraint, or certified structure. We have arrived at a strange edge. In part 12, we granted phi a bottomless depth. Not bottomless in size, bottomless in description. No matter how carefully you look, there is always a finer question you could ask about how phi is arranged. And the moment you accept that, a pressure builds. Because we are finite beings, finite instruments, finite windows of attention. So the question becomes unavoidable. How can anything finite ever touch anything bottomless? How can you measure a thing that has no final layer? Part 13 answers with a rule so simple, it feels like it was always obvious. And yet, almost all confusion in physics is born from refusing to swallow it all the way. Here is the core claim. Absolute phi cannot be measured. Not with better technology, not with a more perfect device, not even in principle. Only differences in phi can be measured. Only comparisons. Only relations. Only change. Let me say it again in even simpler words. There is no such thing as the phi value at a place. There is only phi compared to phi. Only this versus that. Only more than, less than, the same as, shifted by, changed from. That is not a limitation of our tools. That is what it means to be measurable at all. Now, why does this matter? Because if you misunderstand this, you will keep asking questions that have no operational meaning. You will keep building theories that depend on numbers nobody can ever verify. You will keep arguing about what the universe really is, while quietly using hidden reference frames you never earned. And you will call the resulting contradictions mysteries, when they are actually category errors. So we have to walk slowly. We have to earn this permission the way we've earned every permission in this episode, not by declaring it, by showing that the alternative collapses. I'm going to give you one everyday scene, one simple human technology that carries the whole truth. Then we will bring the same truth back into the holophase language, cleanly, without smuggling. Imagine a factory, not a glamorous one, a loud, dusty, honest place where work has consequences. In the middle of the last century, in a textile factory not far from Lahore, thread was produced in long runs and wound onto wooden bobbins. Miles and miles of thread. To sell thread, you had to certify thread. And to certify thread, you had to measure quality. So in one corner, there was a quality station. A table, a lamp, a magnifying lens, a pair of steady hands. And something that surprised young engineers when they first arrived. There was no absolute quality meter, no universal needle that pointed to threadness, no device that said with authority, this thread is objectively a 7.3. Instead, there were cards, small cards with sample threads glued to them, each card labeled with something practical, export grade, domestic grade, batch accepted last month, batch rejected last week. And the inspector, an older man with eyes trained by decades, would do something almost childish. He would hold a new thread next to a sample card. He would feel it, look at it, compare the twist, the fuzz, the thickness, the sheen. And then he would say one of only a few meaningful sentences. Matches. Too coarse. Too thin. within tolerance. Everything ran on comparison. Not because the factory lacked technology, because comparison is what makes a statement checkable. Now imagine a young engineer comes in with a machine, chrome, dials, a moving needle, a printed number. He places a thread sample into the device. The device hums. It prints. Quality index 7.3. The engineer smiles. He thinks he has brought modernity. He thinks he has brought an absolute. The inspector looks at the number and asks the only honest question. 7.3 compared to what? The engineer says, compared to nothing. That's the point. It's absolute. And in that moment, the machine is revealed as a storytelling device, not a measuring device. Because if 7.3 is not tied to a reference, then 7.3 cannot be verified. It cannot be enforced. It cannot be shared. It cannot be audited. A number without a comparison is not a measurement. It is a decoration. So what happens next is instructive. Either the factory throws the machine away, or, if the factory is wise, it rewrites what the machine is allowed to claim. It turns the number into a comparison. Within 2% of sample card 18. Within tolerance of export grade A. Now the device becomes real. Not because it found an absolute, but because it confessed what it was always doing. Comparing one thread to another thread. Comparing one sample to an agreed standard. Measurement is the public ritual of comparison. That factory corner contains the entire metaphysics of part 13. Because phi is not thread. But measurement behaves the same way. To measure is to compare. To measure is to say, relative to this, that is so. To measure is to bind a claim to a reference so others can reproduce it. And the moment you ask for an absolute reading, a reading that does not depend on any reference, you are asking for a claim that cannot be checked. Now bring this back to phi. In the old way of thinking, people want to ask, what is phi here? What is the value of the field right now at this point? But PAL 13 says, that is like asking, what is the absolute thread quality? It sounds like a question. It is not a measurable question. Because here and this point and right now are not primitives we are allowed to assume. And even if we did assume them, an absolute value still would not be observable. Because an isolated number has no meaning without a reference. So in holophase native language, we rewrite the question. We do not ask what is phi. We ask how does phi differ. We ask what is the difference between phi on this licensed window and phi on that licensed window. We ask what is the stable, reproducible, gauge invariant remainder after I allow all unobservable shifts. We ask what survives when I change the labeling. That is the entire move. Absolute phi is unobservable. Differences in phi are the only speakers. And now, to make the claim feel like a law rather than a slogan, we have to say what difference means without smuggling spacetime. Because if we say difference across space too early, we cheat. If we say change over time too early, we cheat. So listen carefully. When I say difference, I do not mean a distance between 2 points in space. I do not mean an interval between 2 moments in time. I mean the primitive act of comparability, the most minimal act. This is not identical to that. This differs from that. This can be distinguished from that. Phi is the primitive of readability. So phi does not need a stage in order to differ. Difference is the first thing. Stages are later readouts. So the difference we talk about in part 13 is pre-geometric. It lives in the abstract event domain we earned earlier. It lives in the ability to compare two phi configurations at all. Now we can state the claim with full rigor, in plain language. A measurement can only report something that remains true under allowed relabelings. If a value can be shifted without changing anything observable, then that value is not observable. Absolute phi can be shifted. You can add a constant offset. You can choose a different zero on the circle. You can choose a different starting point for your label. And nothing that can be checked will change. Therefore, absolute phi is not observable. Only structures built from differences, from changes, from comparisons survive. Only those can be public. Only those can be audited. This is why the holophase grammar prefers dphi over phi. Not because we are being fancy, because we are being honest. The thing that can be measured is not the state. It is the relational remainder between states. Now, you might resist and say, but surely there must be an absolute value underneath, even if we can't measure it. And here, the firewall becomes philosophical surgery. If you assert an absolute that cannot be measured even in principle, you have not added knowledge. You have added a private story. And private stories are exactly what the firewall exists to block. Holophase does not forbid imagination. It forbids pretending imagination is measurement. So in this program, real does not mean I can picture it. Real means licensed, public, reproducible. And by that standard, absolute phi is not real. It is unobservable. Only differences speak. Now let's push deeper. Because part 13 is not only about humility, it is about building power. When you accept that only differences are measurable, something beautiful happens. Many old puzzles stop looking mysterious. Because many old puzzles were created by trying to measure absolutes, trying to assign meaning to an unanchored zero, trying to treat a gauge choice as a substance, trying to reify a label. Here is one simple example that everyone has lived. Someone asks you, how happy are you, from 1 to 10? You answer with a number. And yet you know, truly know, that the number by itself is fog. Because 7 means nothing until you add a comparison. 7 compared to yesterday. 7 compared to last year. 7 compared to the worst day of your life. 7 compared to your friend 7. Without a reference, the number is a gesture. So you naturally translate it into difference language. Better than last week. Worse than when I was younger. Stable. Improving. Happiness is meaningful in differences, not in absolutes. Phi behaves the same way. Not because phi is an emotion, but because measurement behaves the same way wherever it is honest. Measurement is always relational. Now the rigorous part. What does this force us to build? It forces us to build a theory where every claim is invariant under unobservable shifts. In plain terms, if I change the label of phi by a constant, my observable predictions must remain unchanged. If they do not, then my prediction depended on an unobservable absolute, and it is not a licensed claim. So part 13 installs a discipline. We only allow expressions that survive relabeling. We only allow difference-based encoders. We only allow gauge-invariant carriers. We only allow what can be compared publicly. This is not a preference. It is the operational definition of meaning. Now let's connect this to the circle. We earned earlier that phi lives on a cyclic value space. That means phi wraps. No beginning, no end. Now ask yourself, where is 0 on a circle? There is no marked 0 unless you paint one. And if you paint one, you have added a convention, a choice, a private coordinate, not a measurement. So any theory that depends on where you painted zero is not a theory of reality. It is a theory of your paint, a theory of your labels. Therefore, in a cyclic world, absolutes are especially suspicious. Because the circle does not carry a privileged origin. Only differences along the circle can be spoken. Only arcs, only shifts, only winding, only return. That is why later topology becomes so natural in holophase. Because topology is the grammar of what survives relabeling. Topology cares about loops, not origins. It cares about holonomy, not absolute phases. It cares about what happens when you go around and compare, not what you declared at the start. But we must stay disciplined. We are still in undifferentiated phi. We are not yet talking about spacetime loops. We are talking about the general fact that comparisons are the only public content. Now, here is the prediction of part 13. If our claim is true, then every successful measurement in any domain will reduce to a comparison protocol. Even when people swear they are measuring an absolute, you will be able to find the hidden reference, the calibration, the baseline, the zeroing, the subtraction, the differencing, the control, the standard, the sample card. So the prediction is not vague, it is operational. If you open any mature experimental method and strip it down to its logical skeleton, you will find a comparison. A this relative to that. A before relative to after. A signal relative to background. A test relative to control. A window relative to window. And more sharply, if you build a theory whose predictions depend on absolute phi values, those predictions will fail to replicate across laboratories unless the laboratories secretly coordinate the same arbitrary conventions. And when they do coordinate those conventions, what they have actually done is create a shared reference, which means they have converted the supposed absolute into a comparison. That is the prediction. Now the falsification. Here is how part 13 could die. If someone produces a device that measures absolute phi, not a difference, not a comparison, not an interval, not a shift, but an absolute value, and this reading can be verified by others without sharing any reference, then this claim fails. If X happens, this claim fails. X is verifiable absolute phi detection. And notice what verifiable means here. It means different observers can reproduce the claim without first synchronizing an arbitrary convention. No shared sample card, no shared baseline, no shared zero, no hidden agreement. If a device could do that, the holophase discipline would have to change. Now, you might say, that seems impossible. Yes, and the impossibility is the content of part 13. Because verification itself is comparison. Even the act of saying we got the same number is a comparison between readings. Even the act of saying it stayed the same is a comparison across trials. Even the act of saying this device works is a comparison between expectation and outcome. So an absolute that cannot be checked by comparison is not a scientific object. It is a private metaphysical ornament. Holophase refuses ornaments. Now, scope and limits. Part 13 is not claiming that phi has no value. It is claiming that the value has gauge freedom, freedom to shift, and therefore is not directly observable. Part 13 is not claiming that nothing is real. It is claiming that what is real, in the firewall sense, is what is invariant under unobservable relabelings. Part 13 is not yet telling you how differences become public. That comes later, in the licensing parts, when we speak of coherence windows and how a comparison becomes certified. Right now, we are still earning permissions. So at this stage, we do not assume spacetime. We do not assume a metric. We do not assume dynamics. We do not assume an energy substance. If energy enters this part, it enters only as tally, accounted bookkeeping of certified differences once readouts become public. Not as a thing that explains, not as a fluid that pushes. Energy is a receipt, not a god. Now, let me give you a second scene, not as a second analogy to carry the argument, but as a tightening of the same truth in a harsher environment. High on a wind-scoured pass near the Afghan-Pakistan border, imagine an outpost. Stone walls, a stove, a small window. In winter, a blizzard comes and erases the world. All landmarks disappear under white. The sentry looks out and sees nothing but sameness. And in that sameness, a question tries to form. Did the outpost move? But move relative to what? The border marker is gone. The ridgeline is hidden. The path is buried. Even the horizon is swallowed. In a blank world, absolute position evaporates. The sentry can only feel one thing: differences. He can feel whether the floor pushes differently. He can feel whether his body is being accelerated. He can feel whether something changed relative to his own reference. And when, days later, the snow recedes and the rock reappears, the first real knowledge returns. Not an absolute, a relation. This rock is here again. I can see the other ridge again. The world becomes measurable again the moment references return, because measurement is relational. That outpost scene is the same as the factory. The factory had sample cards. The outpost lost its sample cards and became blind. Not blind in the eyes, blind in the ability to verify. Now, if you want the cleanest, most ruthless expression of part 13, imagine a windowless craft. No stars, no horizon, no external reference. You can run experiments inside. You can compare before and after. You can detect acceleration. You can detect rotation. You can detect tidal differences across your own body. But you cannot detect absolute velocity. Not because you are weak, because absolute velocity has no operational content without an external comparison. And what you can detect are not absolutes. They are differences, changes in your state, differences across your local frame. Again, only differences speak. Now bring it home to holophase again, because this is where the rigor lives. Phi is the primitive of comparability. So absolute phi would mean a value that is meaningful without comparison. But comparability is what phi is. So an absolute phi is like a word with no alphabet. It is like a measure with no ruler. It is like an answer with no question. Meaning is relational. Measurement is relational. Therefore, the only licensed content is differential content. This is why, when the mathematics later arrives, the central observable will not be phi as a raw number. It will be the connection-like object that encodes differences, the how phi changes object, the thing you can integrate around loops and compare across overlaps, the thing that survives coordinate changes. But we are not doing that full build here. We are earning the permission that makes that build necessary. Now let me show you how this permission prevents a common mistake. People often imagine the universe as a container filled with values, as if reality were graph paper and phi were ink stamped at each square. And they ask, what is the ink value in square number 1? But holophase says there is no graph paper at the start. And even if there were, there is no absolute ink value that can be read without a reference. So the right picture is not values on a grid. The right picture is differences that can be compared. And later, if you insist on drawing a grid, The grid will be something you reconstruct from the comparison structure. Spacetime will be the album you build from the photographs, not the pre-printed pages. And once you accept that, you stop treating your coordinate choices as reality. You stop treating your zeros as substances. You stop treating your gauges as gods. You become operationally honest. Now, here is the deeper philosophical shift, said gently. If only differences are measurable, then the universe is not a collection of absolute properties. It is a fabric of relations. And our instruments, our senses, our minds, they are not discoverers of absolutes. They are comparison engines, difference detectors. They do not reveal the world by reading its private inner numbers. They reveal the world by stabilizing shared comparisons, by building public reference protocols, by making relational claims repeatable. This does not make the universe subjective. It makes objectivity precise. Objectivity is the convergence of comparisons under licensing, not access to an absolute. Now we return briefly to energy, because people will try to smuggle it in here. They will say, if absolute phi is unobservable, maybe energy is the absolute instead. No. Energy is not the primitive. Energy is a tally, a count of certified changes once change becomes public. A bookkeeping number linked to repeatable differences in omega and kappa and nu once those readouts are licensed. Energy is not the thing that explains why differences exist. Energy is the receipt you print after you have measured differences. So part 13 protects the program from a common retreat. When absolutes fail, people grab for a different absolute. HOLOPHASE says, stop grabbing, accept the structure. Only differences speak. Now listen, we have done the claim. We have done why it matches. We have done the prediction. We have done the falsification. We have marked the scope. We have kept the firewall. So what remains is what you carry. One sentence, one handle. Here it is. Measurement is always relational. Keep that sentence like a sample card in your pocket. Anytime someone hands you a number, ask, compare to what? Anytime a theory speaks in absolutes, ask, where is the hidden reference? Anytime your own mind says, this is the final truth, ask, what would it mean to verify it? And you will notice something strange. You will notice that the most powerful statements in science are not absolute declarations. They are relational invariances. They are, this stays the same under this change. They are, this difference is conserved. They are, this comparison is stable. They are, this pattern persists across representations. That is why mathematics works. Because mathematics is the art of what survives transformation. And holophase is the same art, anchored in phi. Now, a calm closing. We have earned the right to stop asking for absolute phi. We have earned the right to build only with differences. And that means the next part is inevitable. Because if only differences matter, we must explain how differences become public, how a comparison becomes licensed, how two observers can share a reference without smuggling it, how coherence creates a common world out of private possibilities. That is where we go next. For now, stand in that factory corner, light over the table, sample cards in a row, a new thread held beside an old thread. And hear the only sentence that science can truly defend. Within tolerance. That is measurement. That is reality made public. Only differences speak. Always peace be upon you.